What is the creepiest, most bone-chilling thing you've ever read online that claims to be true? Story 1. The Smiling Man. That is very creepy. No cruelty, illegal substances, physical relations, or anything gross. It was also made into a short film. About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. To pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night. Never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the illegal substance peddlers in the city were polite. But all of that changed in just a few minutes of one evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police-patrolled park quite a ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, to my side, was the silhouette of a man dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance-walking, headed straight for me. Deciding he was probably buzzed, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky, and he was wearing an old suit. He danced closer still, until I could make out his face. His eyes were wide and wild, and his head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was formed in a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off him to cross the empty street. As I reached the other side, I glanced back and then stopped dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing and was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again but kept my eyes on the man. I didn't move. Once I had put about half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing to find him gone. For the briefest of moments, I felt relieved until I noticed him. He'd crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I'd looked away from him no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he'd moved fast. I was so shocked that I stood there for some time staring at him, and then he started moving toward me again. He took giant, exaggerated, tiptoed steps as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone, except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say that at this point I ran away or pulled out my pepper spray, my cell phone, or anything at all, but I didn't. I just stood there completely frozen as the smiling man crept toward me. And then he stopped again, about a car length away from me. Still smiling, he's still looking at the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. What I meant to ask was, "What do you want?" In an angry, commanding tone. What came out was a whimper. "What the f-" Regardless of whether or not humans can smell for you, they can certainly hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid. But he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there, smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around very slowly and started dance-walking away. Just like that. Not wanting to turn my back on him, I again watched him go until he was far enough away to be almost out of sight. Then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way. This time, he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off the side road and back onto a better lit road with sparse traffic. Looking behind me, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see his stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that night, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look buzzed. He didn't look baked. He looked completely and utterly insane. And that's a very, very scary thing to see. Story time. True story time. I was quite young and my parents had just separated. My mom was living in a 2-bedroom apartment. I had my own room, but I liked sleeping in her bed whenever I was staying with her. Our 2 bedrooms were at the end of a hallway, directly across from each other. Our apartment was on the first floor. And I remember that it was in the middle of the summer and my mom had a window open in her room that was directly behind the bed, above the headboard. Anyway, I woke up in the middle of the night and remembered sitting up and seeing that our cat was sitting in the doorframe of my mom's room. Her door was open and you could partially see into my bedroom. It was strange because our cat was a huge snuggler and was typically always in bed with us. As I was watching, he walked into my bedroom and meowed. I turned to face my mom and woke her up. In the 3-4 seconds it took her to wake up and ask me what was wrong, we both looked back up in the doorframe and there was a man standing by my open door, making his way out of my bedroom. I still don't know how she managed to do it so quickly, but my mother proceeded to pick me up and literally throw me out of the screen window. Again, we were on the first floor and it was maybe a 3-foot drop to the ground. She quickly followed and we were able to start screaming for help and someone called 911. The police came but didn't see any signs of forced entry, only that her front door was unlocked, which led them to believe the man must have exited that way. But the strange thing was that my mom swore up and down that she had locked the door that night with the deadbolt and chain lock. About a week later, she was cleaning the kitchen, opened up her water heater closet and found a notebook with names and drawings, as well as a pair of gloves and some gum wrappers. The man had been in her house and hid until we were asleep. Story 3. An ex-boyfriend of mine was an Iraqi Kurd. He told me a crazy story from camping in the woods in northern Iraq. He and a few friends were skipping school the day before the weekend. Thursday in the Middle East. They had plans to go right after school, thus their parents thought they were at school, so they left their iPhones at home so their parents couldn't see where they were. The rumor in the area outside is that in the woods outside Erbil, the people who were gassed by a former Iraqi leader were banished, the ones that lived, with their birth defects, essentially hills of eyes. Authorities refused to enter those woods, etc. So back to my ex. They arrived at the woods and parked their car on the road at the bottom of a hill. They set camp and made a fire and began like teenage boys to scare each other and recall the stories about these banished, for lack of a better word, mutants. As night falls, they begin to hear whispering in the trees and twigs snapping. They retreat to the tent and let the fire die alone outside out of fear. As the fire dies, they hear the voices getting closer and start to panic, trying to keep quiet. There are more than a dozen mutants outside the tent. They hear all of their stuff being rummaged through and they lay petrified in the tent just looking at each other. One of the mutants asked if they should see who's in the tent, to which another replied, "Leave them." Unable to call for help, they wait till dawn breaks only to find their entire camp destroyed with no money missing, no electronics missing, just food, cooking pots, and clothing missing. Trying to gather what had happened, a lone woman walks down the hill towards them. She has no fingers and is wrapped in fabric sheds. At this point, they bolted barefoot down the hill, trying to reach the car. When my ex reached the bottom near a stream, he stopped to cross it, and squatting in the river, taking a whiz, was a young girl with no hair, no nose, and a missing eye just staring at him. She starts to scream as loud as she can. Worried she'll alert the others, he keeps running. When he gets to the car, his friends are waiting for him, but the car has already been raided. They have left the keys at the camp. Needless to say, they walked until they hitched a ride. A few months later, an Austrian film crew fled the forest in the same manner after filming a documentary. However, they had reportedly found a cabin full of gore along with police in military uniforms. Story 4. Ted's Cave. Ted and his girlfriend went caving. The cave was your general creepy, scary haunted house scenario. They heard strange noises and sounds, and once, they even heard a man-bear pig-like scream. They discovered a small passage accessible only by a hole about 6 inches wide in each direction. They spent days opening the hole wide enough for Ted to climb through. Ted eventually climbed through and found himself in a long, winding passage. Eventually, it opened up into a large room. He walked around and took some pictures. He took a picture of a peculiar round rock and what looked like a hieroglyphic on the wall. This room had never been reached by any human before via the passage they went through, so this was weird. Ted climbed back to his friend and they left to come back later. They looked at the picture back at their hotel and found that none of the pictures taken inside the cavern came out. Every other picture was fine. The next day they came with another friend, Joe. Joe was an expert minuscule caver. Joe went into the passage first, followed by Ted. Ted banged his head and started to bleed, so he said he couldn't go on. Joe wanted to continue by himself, so he did. A while later, Joe came back pale, panting, and completely freaked out. They asked Joe why he looked like this, but he didn't answer. They kept prodding him with questions and he gave brief replies. Did you get to the cavern? No. Did you see the round rock? No. Eventually, they discovered that he just felt sick exploring. So sick that he immediately decided to return and could not continue. Ted, Joe, and his friend all left. Later, Ted and his friend came back to the cave one last time. Ted climbed through the passage and into the cavern. He went to the far end of the cavern and heard a rock scraping on rock noise behind him. He turned around quickly and crashed his head into the low ceiling. This broke his headlight and left him in total darkness. He fumbled for his glow sticks and lit them. These were dim. You could only see about 5 feet in front of you at any time. He was desperate to get back to his friend, so he returned the way he came. He came across the round rock mentioned earlier and noticed that it had moved. This was the scraping noise. Underneath the rock was a new passage, about 3 feet by 3 feet. Obviously, he freaked out and crawled his way back through the passage as fast as he possibly could. He didn't worry about hurting himself, but he just wanted to get out ASAP. During his crawl back, a wind blew through the crawl space, carrying the putrid smell. He almost threw up when he heard his friend scream at him to hurry up. This made him even more anxious and scared. When he finally got out through the hole they created, he was left in the dark all alone. His friend started to get out of there without him. Ted eventually caught up just as his friend was climbing up a vertical 15-foot rope leading out of the cave. Ted and his friend climbed out, both covered in numerous scrapes and bruises. When they reached the top, the rope they used to climb out pulled tight. Something from the cave was pulling the rope. Ted's friend ripped out his pocket knife and worked on the rope. In 5 seconds, he cut it, and the withered end whistled past them back into the deep abyss. They drove home in silence. I'm not sure which is creepier, the claustrophobia or the supernatural stuff. If you think that story is disturbing, wait till you hear the next one. So hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more bone-chilling stories. Story 5. The story starts off in the early 1900s, with a family living on the outskirts of town. There are 10 family members in total, the standard mother, father, and daughter, and I believe the rest are extended family and siblings. The daughter, as the story goes, would play house or other childlike games during the day while the family did chores, not far from the home. but for some reason, on this particular day she ventures a little farther away. The reason why has since escaped me is maybe picking berries. Anyway, as she's playing, there's a snapping of twigs. She stays put, thinking it's probably family or an animal. Then a figure comes into view. Tall, hairy, with long arms. The creature approaches the girl, followed by another of its kind, and they grin. Think the gentleman from BTVS, but furry. They chase the girl to her home, she screams for help, and her father and other male family members shoot at the creatures and send the dogs after them. Several nights after the incident, the child is playing indoors, with her mother in the kitchen or not far off, and the rest of the family nearby. Something makes her look out the window where she sees the grinning face of the creature watching her. The family rushes to the upper level of the home while the dogs chase the creature. There's banging on the exterior walls and doors. The next day there are gashes along the sides of the house and door. Incidents like this occurred for several years after this, until the family just stopped going into town. Townsfolk assumed they had moved, fed up with the wild animal attacks. Now the classmate who told me this story is from the town near where the family lived. When he heard this story, he went to check out the house. As you can expect, the house was in ruin from 50 plus years of disuse. But around the back were 10 unmarked graves. The creature has been dubbed the Travers Spine Sasquatch. Story 6. This is a story that my friend's grandfather told us. Grandpa owned a large herd of sheep, which during the summer grazed in the mountains in central Utah. In the 1960s, his shepherd was a small Mexican man. We'll call him Juan. Juan stayed in a very small trailer in a meadow while tending the sheep. One evening, Grandpa drives his truck up the mountain to deliver some food and supplies to Juan. As he nears Juan's camp, he starts seeing slain sheep all over the ground. As he arrives at Juan's trailer, he finds the door shut. He has to kick open the door to get inside as Juan has locked it. Inside, Juan is curled up into a ball, mumbling incoherently and likely in shock. Grandpa picks up Juan, throws him into the truck, and takes off down the mountain to get Juan to a doctor. As he's flying down the twisty dirt road, Grandpa gets this terrible feeling like he's being watched and sees something out of the corner of his eye. By this time, the sun is setting. The light isn't very good. He turns to look out the passenger side window and sees a creature he describes as looking like an inside-out deer, running alongside the truck. The creature drops back out of sight, only to come bounding back even faster, running on its hind legs only. The creature then runs across the road right in front of the truck. Grandpa swerves to miss it and ends up rolling the truck down the mountainside. Juan passed away in the accident, and Grandpa spent more than a month in the hospital. Story 7. My uncle owns a large 100-plus acre farm in North Carolina, which I would go to during summer vacation to spend time with my cousins. One year in the late 80s, my brother and I woke up for some reason and couldn't fall back asleep. So we hung out, talking and looking out the second-story window over at the large old farmhouse about 30 yards away. The old farmhouse, which was built in the 1880s, had been sitting empty for decades. If there was ever a stereotypically scary old house, this was it. So, as my brother and I are surveying the farm, shooting the breeze, we look into the southwest corner window on the second floor and see a blue-gray glowing person staring at us. Clear as day. We proceed to freak out, wake up my dad and alert him to the glowing person, only for it to be gone when he comes into our room. Fast forward 8 years and I'm visiting the farm again. For some reason or another, my aunt and uncle had to take my cousins to something and gave me the option of going with them or staying back in the farm. Sensing my first free time in weeks, I pounced on the opportunity to be left alone. The day was really overcast, so I didn't want to venture too far away with the prospect of rain hanging over my head. I wandered down the yard to the trampoline, positioned a few yards from the old farmhouse. I commenced jumping and flipping for about 10 minutes until I felt this glare in my neck, which seemed to paralyze me instantly. And in that instant, the memory of that night 8 years earlier came flooding back. I turned my head, looked at the southwest second-story window, and there it was. Same ominous glow, same outfit, same stare. I turned away from the window and somehow managed to continue to jump. All the while, the glare felt like a hand on my shoulder. After another minute or two, I turned back to see the glowing person and not wavered. At this point, I lost my cool and ran as fast as I possibly could into my cousin's room, shut the blinds, and had a heart attack until we got home. Story 8. I was young when this happened. My uncle and I were finishing up chopping and gathering firewood for my grandmother because it was getting dark. Driving back on a dirt road at about 30 kilometers per hour, I had this awful sense of being watched. Before I could turn to look out my window, my uncle quickly shouted, "Don't!" I completely froze. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest and completely stopped when I heard a tap on my window. My uncle sped up and was loudly praying in my native language. I didn't know what was going on and thought it was over until our truck suddenly dipped from the bed. My uncle then started saying, "Look at me, and don't turn away," over and over. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, but from the window behind me. It was getting harder for me to breathe and I wanted to cry. A minute or two passed and the truck dipped again. My uncle looked around and sighed. It was quiet. Besides the truck and the road, he looked at me and said, "We will ask your father to do a prayer in the morning, so the evil will forget our faces." Navajo to English equivalent. I remember curling up on the seat and just staring at the radio, watching the time. I listened to my uncle sing an old prayer until we got to my grandmother's house. I called my uncle because I had a nightmare about that night. We talked about it for a bit. He said, "I didn't see faces, just eyes, like brake lights you see on the road. It watched you." Navajo to English equivalent. Before hanging up, I tried joking with him about it. Why didn't you just step on the brake when it was in the back? He didn't, and he just paused. Because it wasn't alone. Story 9. My parents bought their first house in 1972. It was a fixer-upper, but they decided to move in right away and fix things as time and money permitted. Within a few days of moving in, the new neighbors came over to introduce themselves. They also let my parents know that the previous owners had moved out after a nasty divorce. They had lost their second baby to SIDS, and their relationship went downhill from there. My parents were horrified, more so because they were newly pregnant and couldn't imagine going through such a thing. They eventually pretty much forgot all about it. Life went on. In preparation for the baby, they decided to wallpaper the nursery. And my dad told my mom there was no need to wallpaper the inside of the closet, but she insisted. She was kneeling down, scraping off old paint inside the closet, when her eyes fell upon something that made her freeze. Written in crayon about eye level for a kindergarten, and childish scrawl was,
"I ended the baby."
Story 10. A little girl was playing in her room when, from down in the kitchen, she heard her mother call, "Emily, come here." So Emily gets up and runs down the stairs. At the bottom, as she runs past the cupboard door under the stairs, the door opens up and an arm reaches out from behind her, covers her mouth and pulls her into the cupboard. In the darkness behind her, the little child hears her mother's voice saying, "Quiet, Emily, quiet. I hear it too." What is so freaky about this to me is not just what it is, but that the mother was standing downstairs and heard her own voice calling her daughter from the kitchen. How disturbing would that be? I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you made it this far, I'm sure you'll also enjoy. What's the scariest true story you know? Story 4 is so shocking. See you on that video.